Yeah, so as we're transferring over today and making sure that we get you the information that you need to either go down your adventure of migration and hopefully help you out a little bit with your migration plans and your different options that you can do and can use.
Jason, there you go.
Right there. Alrighty, so I'm going to pick up right where I left off. So the first thing I want to cover is what is a file system migration. Now, file system migrations may be a loaded term because some people will say, hey, I don't know if I have a file system. They might be considered shared drives. They may be considered a Z drive or an H drive or something along those lines. However, what you can be sure of, if you have something that looks like this, that you go and store your documents or information on your internal network, that is essentially a file share, and that's where you're storing your information and it's being backed up and being managed on there. Well, what we're talking about today is actually taking that content and moving it into a SharePoint space. And SharePoint offers a whole lot of great features, and we'll go over that just here in a little bit about why you would want to do that. But I just want to make sure we're on the same page of what we're talking about. Now, there are some different things that we want to talk about, and it may be one of you guys or all of you guys may fall into different areas, but there are three essential things that you may want to do. You might be moving, you may be migrating, or you may be upgrading. And these three different things are different because of how we're going to actually interact and do these individual actions. So moving, basically this is a procedure that would be moving maybe current servers to maybe new servers, or moving a file share from maybe an H drive to a Z drive or something along those lines. So moving really isn't a migration, more so is just taking the same content and moving it to the same area somewhere else. What we're going to be talking about today and focusing on today is migration. So basically making data from one location to another system. So changing it, how it works, changing how it looks, changing how it functions. And then the last thing is the upgrade. So if you're upgrading software versions or upgrading different things, SharePoint specifically has that because SharePoint has a life cycle, a software life cycle, where they upgrade every 3 years. So typically you see SharePoint 2007, 2010, and then 2013, which is the current version that we're on. Now, some migration sources, where are we moving from, how we're moving, and the one we're talking about today is going to be file shares and local system files. So if it's a share drive, it's an H drive, it's a Z drive. Some people call it differently depending on what organization you're in and how you're leveraging it. But don't forget, there are also legacy and other content management systems out there. So CMS stands for Content Management System. It may be using the same file system as storage, which then you can then migrate to SharePoint as well. For maybe reasons that that system is no longer going to be supported, or it doesn't provide the technical support that you need. So why do we migrate? Why do we need to get away from file shares, and why do we need to get to SharePoint? Well, these are just some of the typical things that we look at. So if we need to access files over basically the internet, not internet all the time, but essentially if it's internal to you guys, internal network, meaning you have to be in your work site to access, or if you have to have like a VPN to get into your system, or if it's accessible over a network, a secure network, like HTTPS. And sometimes that's very important because if you're at home, or if you're teleworking, or if you have geographically spaced resources throughout the U.S. or the world, essentially you don't want to have that access wherever you go. So being able to access your files over HTTP and HTTPS is going to be a real driving force to migrate to SharePoint. The next thing is you have files that need to be managed by a content management system. So all of us are guilty of this, but we have files and you name them maybe _v1, _v2, _final. And what that does is that's really document management, but it's poor document management because you never know who has what version, what's going on. And that's one of the reasons why you need a system that manages the documents, as well as permissions, as well as business process automation like workflow, as well as if documents need to be in a collaborative process. So if you're working on maybe a document, maybe a PowerPoint, for example, and you need to be able to pass that around to different departments, different people, and then you all need to look at that. Instead of shooting it over email and losing copies and losing the audit trail and losing who has it and who changed what, SharePoint can handle that and be able to engage everybody in your company or in your organization in that collaborative process. And last but not least, another great reason to migrate to SharePoint from file shares is to build that process automation. So in file shares, I don't want to call them dumb documents, but essentially they don't do anything. They just sit there. They're being stored. When you move them into SharePoint, SharePoint 2010, 2013, whatever it may be, we open up the ability to do business automation. So technical requirements to do maybe approval processes, publishing processes. All those processes become available for you when you move it into a system that can be managed that way. Now, those are the top reasons that I see that. Now, your organization may be looking at a compliance area that might be beneficial to move to SharePoint, or just space. You're running out of file share space and you need to move to SharePoint, or data documents. Any number of those reasons can be a great stepping stone to get into SharePoint. And today, and hopefully what I'm going to give you today is a basis of knowledge and some ways to get started and get yourself moving along in that direction. So, well, why SharePoint? There's a lot of systems out there that claim to do document management and versioning and all that great stuff. Well, the one thing I can say is SharePoint is awesome, and it's the greatest platform in the world. No, I'm just kidding, but it's great. If you attended our webinar, our first webinar, we asked what SharePoint can do for you. And what I'm going to do is provide a SharePoint overview of why people choose SharePoint in different organizations and across the world, across the U.S. and through Fortune 500 companies and organizations. You can still organize documents pretty quickly, searchable, add metadata, help protect from unauthorized access from a security standpoint, and once again, ensure that your compliance and your governance and your business automation continues so that business connectivity across all the departments. If you weren't able to attend our webinar, our first, what SharePoint can do for you, we have it on YouTube and we have it on our website. But also feel free to reach out to Ed or myself or Joy to get some more information that we can kind of help you out. Also, SharePoint, is a known product. So as you can see, this is the Magic Quadrant from Gartner, and you can see Microsoft lies right there in the highest visionary and leaders of the ECM, which is Enterprise Content Management arena. So what we're talking about today is not a conversation that I'm sure you haven't had with your management, or you haven't had this conversation with your IT staff or your business units. So it is a very popular and very deployed system that's out there and ready to go and take in those documents. Now, when you start talking about migration, be it from a file system, be it from a different system, you typically have options. Same thing goes for migration from a file system. So the three that we've identified and that we use quite often is, one, a manual migration, essentially picking up documents from your file share and moving into SharePoint. The second one is an automated migration via custom code. And once again, just as relevant, the biggest thing here is you would need some knowledge and need some resources that know how to do code, know how to manage that aspect. And then the third one, the third-party migration tools. There's a ton of them out there. We're partners with some, and I will. If you contact us outside of the webinar, I'll feel free to give you some recommendations and the reasons why we pick the best in breed and we do our analysis on it. So those are the three. The one we're going to concentrate on today, and I think a lot of most people fall in, is the manual migration. Due to budgeting or due to availability of products and different things and resources, most of the time this falls into the manual migration. And I don't want you guys to think like, hey, I have to do this manually, it's going to take me forever, I'm never going to get this done, I'm going to do it wrong. And really what today is to make sure that we concentrate on the manual migration, because the other two, the automated and the third-party tool type of migration, it's still relevant, and everything you want to go through would still need to be done when you're using a tool. It just makes some of the parts a little easier and a little bit more automated. But the process and the method that we're doing is going to look like this. And this is important because this will be the same situation if we do any migration. We need to discover the content we have. We need to cleanse it. We need to get rid of it, purge it, clean it, scrub it, and then we're going to organize it. Now, once it's all organized, we have it all planned out, we need to create a migration plan to get into SharePoint, how we're getting in there. This is the most important step behind any migration. You can say, hey, I'm going to migrate everything tomorrow without a plan, and I guarantee it's going to not look pretty when you're done. And I'll show you each one of these steps and how to do it manually. Once again, I want to show you a manual process because many of you might fall in that situation where you only have the manual process to be available for you. So we're going to go through each one of these steps throughout the day. Now, some migration considerations, specifically from a file share, and these are important. These aren't the ones that you read the brochure. It's going to tell you, hey, this is undoubtedly what you're going to run into, but I can promise you these are the things that you're going to run into and you need to plan for. First thing is permissions. So if you're using a third-party migration tool, typically that handles permissions. You don't have to worry about it. But doing a manual migration, permissions are at the forefront because in file systems you set the permissions at a folder level, and then inside the folder those documents are scoped out to be basically so no one can get into it. It's basically locked. And that's really where a lot of the troubles come out at first. Now, if you plan for it and we can kind of look at it, most definitely we can kind of counter that. The second thing is SharePoint size boundaries. So SharePoint does have boundaries based upon the available resources it has for it. Now, that might be a conversation for your IT staff to talk about with you if you're a business unit. If you're IT, it's a lot of deal with your server architecture. If you have a lot of space, then you may be good, but it's something that you have to plan for and talk about with everybody and keep that communication, that transparency open for your whole staff. Just to give you an example, if SharePoint has available 50 gigs of space, meaning I can migrate up to 50 gig of documents to SharePoint, but I look at my file share and I have 150 gig of data. Well, that's a problem because once I start migrating, I'm going to hit a stopgap because I cannot migrate anymore into SharePoint because it's running out of space. So that is a consideration. The next thing is the file size limits. So SharePoint natively has limits set. That way, when you're uploading a file, if it's too big, it'll say, "Hey, I can't really handle this big of a file. I'm going to block it." And now that can be loosely set because in SharePoint we're able to set those terms at a higher level, but at most times it is set at 20 megabyte by standard, meaning I can upload 20 megabyte files without problem. Now that can be increased up to 2 gigabytes. So gigabytes is a lot bigger than megabytes, but it has to be set at a farm level, so your IT staff or your administrational staff has to do that. Same thing with file restrictions. So there are files that SharePoint just does not allow in there. Once again, it is set, it is managed at the top level. However, it's pretty a good idea to keep those out of there anyways. Most notably, your file restrictions that are going to be really big are going to be .exe, so that's going to be your executable files, things that run programs. RAW files, so RAR files, which is essentially zip files. Anything that has a PowerShell command to it or something that can run. And the reason being is it protects the individual computers that it's loaded on. So if I click an exe program that's in SharePoint, that may cause me an issue on my local computer when I'm trying to run a software program from SharePoint. And this last thing is file name limits. This is probably the most prevalent one, meaning this is the one that happens the most. And we're all pretty much guilty of this. Special characters in the file name. And this includes ampersand, number sign, pound sign, star, bracket, slash, colon. All those ones that you see on my screen right now are not allowed in SharePoint. And the reason they're not allowed in SharePoint is because in SharePoint, everything is translated to a web URL. So when you go to www.google.com or www.bing.com, essentially that is URL. These individual characters are basically not allowed to be in there. So essentially SharePoint blocks it. So if you have a file system and you have terabytes of data and you have all these special characters in there, you're undoubtedly going to run into some problems when you try to start migrating. The last one is the file name length. So once again, kind of going back to the URL. So not just SharePoint, but all URLs are limited by the number of characters that you can put in a URL. It can only get so big. And actually, it's 128 for SharePoint. So your file name can only equal 128 characters. The problem with this is every time you add a folder, which we're all guilty of, adding a folder of a subfolder of a subfolder of a subfolder, you're going to hit that URL limit a lot faster if you're not using folders. And it's actually one of my recommendations moving forward is to be free of folders. Get rid of them. You're not going to need them. SharePoint handles things a little differently, and I'm going to show you all the great things about that just in a few minutes when we get into the demonstration. But before we do, I want to talk about some other challenges that we have. So, I do SharePoint for a living. I look at websites, blog articles. I interact with different shows and webinars and LinkedIn and everything else. And typically, some comments that I hear, it just SharePoint becomes a dumping ground for all documents by most users. Meaning, if they don't know what to do with it, they go to SharePoint and get it all gunked up. And then around 10,000 documents or so, chaos will ensue. And basically, the rules will fall off and you'll be sitting in water. Well, there are ways to get around that, and governance is definitely one of them, and we're going to talk a lot about governance in our migration, but also some recognition of different things that I wanted to talk about. So the first thing is migrations are phased, meaning everything is not going to go into SharePoint just by one day. You're not going to just open up and say, hey, all my file system is now in SharePoint. It is a phased process. And what I typically tell people to do is get a small group that is really excited about SharePoint and get them into SharePoint. Let them start using it. And then slowly migrate individual units or business units or departments over step by step. And just a quick segue, I know there's a question. File size limits cannot be set by file type. They are just set as in general. So if I say, hey, my file limit is 2 gigabytes, it's 2 gigabytes for all files. Just kind of give you a heads up. All right. The next one is migrations are illiterate. So basically, you shouldn't plan for just one migration. You should plan multiple migrations, a number of attempts, and each one you have to get better with. So the first migration, you might have missed some files got in there that are dirty that you weren't supposed to get in there. Get it better next time. Smaller chunk migrations work better. Saying, hey, one's going to be the one we do and that's it, will definitely happen and will cause the next one, which are migrations are error prone. There is no easy button for SharePoint migrations. It's going to happen. We're going to run into issues. But to be able to mitigate the risks and the issues that we can face, that planning side, the side we're going to actually look at so much today, will counter a lot of those issues. Now, it's not going to get all of them, but most of them will help. And the fourth thing is to make sure your migration is not the end goal. Your end goal should be a platform that houses your document that is searchable, usable, and functionable for all employees. You have that in your mind, and your migration will go a lot smoother than just trying to keep a checkbox, to check a box saying, hey, I migrated all the documents from FileShare to SharePoint. Okay. Now, as we're moving forward, just to kind of give some housekeeping, depending on what your level of knowledge for SharePoint is, I do want to go over some key terms that I'll be talking about today to make sure you have an understanding as I'm saying site and library, so you kind of have an understanding. The first thing is sites. SharePoint runs on websites. Now, there are sites that have functionality to them, but they are sites. Now, sites can be essentially the difference between, for example, Amazon to Google. Now, they're totally separate sites or websites, but they have different functions. Same sites in SharePoint are very similar. So you may have a site specifically for IT. You might have a site specifically for HR. And the difference between these guys are going to be what's available for them. And permissions. So you might have access to go to the HR site, but you might not have permissions to go to the IT site. And it's basically a logic separator between two very different processes or different business units. The next guys are lists and libraries. So SharePoint runs on lists and libraries. These are basically the lifeblood of SharePoint. Libraries, think of them just like as the Library of Congress. They store documents. They store PDFs, they store PowerPoint presentations, and that's where document management happens. The sister of it is lists, which essentially are everything else that's not documents. So think of calendars, think of contact lists, think of announcements, where you might not have a document associated with that content, but it is content, and SharePoint handles that in lists. So usually, typically, those two things are going to be natively what you run into SharePoint. Next thing is a migration plan, and we're going to go over the migration plan, but it's basically those steps that we talked about. So discovering, cleansing, planning, and migrating. So once again, making sure that the migration plan is in place, making sure expectations are set, making sure it's clearly communicated to everybody, and you'll have a better time. The next thing in these two content types and metadata are going to go back to governance. If you just throw all your documents into SharePoint from a file system and keep the folders and keep everything the way it is, you're going to have a bad time, because you're going to have that situation where people are just a dumping ground. You're just going to throw documents in there when you don't know what to do with them, and they're not don't have any metadata to them, which metadata by definition is data about data. If you're not sure what that is, you already know what it is. When you look at your file system, you see the modified person, when it was accessed, who created it. That is essentially metadata. SharePoint handles metadata, but that's where the power of SharePoint becomes when you're doing file system migrations. That produces a lot of your search functionality as well as your filtering functionality. Content types are essentially document types, and you know those as well. You just might not know them in context. But essentially, if you have a template, like let's say you have a document template that you use to write up your status reports or RFPs or something along those lines, and that template is basically a document type. Template is a document type. Because it has specific data that's about it. You can have many pieces of metadata to one content type. And we're going to cover a lot of this in the demonstration in just a minute. The next thing is permissions. SharePoint handles permissions in a way that most systems will not. One is, if you don't have access to it, you don't see it. So chances are, if you have documents inside SharePoint, a folder or a site or a list or a library, and there's specific permissions on it that you don't have access to see, you just don't see it. And the great thing about that is because, I think just in general, people are curious. So if I have a file up there saying executive bonuses, chances are I'm going to click on it a few times just to see if I can get in. Now, in SharePoint, if you don't have access to it, you're not going to see, won't even know it exists, so you won't have that curiosity to click on it. And this is also very important from a compliance standpoint. So if there's PII or PHI that's associated with it, or if you're trying to go some other compliance like 508 or something like that, permissions will come into play there. Second thing is archiving and the archive. SharePoint can handle archiving just like your file systems can, and it's important because a lot of your documents that haven't been touched might not need to be migrated. So if there's a lot of documents that haven't been touched for 6 years, do you really need to keep them in there? Or do you really need to move them and spend the time and effort to move them over? If the answer is yes, because it's a compliance area that we need to keep all documents for X amount of years, then we can also start to do some archiving. Get it out of the normal places that you would look at it. And what that does is it declutters everything. So it makes it easier to find documents that are relevant, something that's very high in terms of read and write and very high in terms of looking at it. And last but not least is search. So just like you go to Bing.com, you search out SharePoint 2010, you get results back. SharePoint handles the same situation, but it's so related to your metadata. So in your file systems, basically the only thing you can really search upon is your file name. So typically most people have file names that are very long. Like this is Jason Dawsey's resume 2014, #1. And that's how you search documents in file shares. In SharePoint's a little different because SharePoint can search not only the file name, but you can search within the document if it's OCR'd, which is basically if the computer can read the document inside, as well as the metadata, so that data about data inside SharePoint as well. So all those things come into play when you're doing searching, and that's really, I think, the power outside of just document management that SharePoint provides, and a reason to migrate from your file system to SharePoint to make life easier. And yourself, you're probably sitting there thinking, well, Jason, that doesn't make sense because I'm finding my documents just fine. But think about it. In one day, when you're in your file shares, think about how much time you spend searching documents. Now, they might be in file folders. You might know how to navigate them, but going to another folder structure that you might not know. Think about how long that takes you on a daily basis. It may be 30 seconds every hour, but you add that up over the course of the year, and that's a lot of time. So it's really a big, powerful moving feature. All right, so what we're going to talk about today, discovery. Looking at the documents I have, we're going to cleanse them, get rid of the files I don't want, organize them, get them into a migrational state. Plan. We're going to make up the SharePoint resource that we need, and then we're going to migrate some documents. So I'm hoping you guys are ready, and I'm hoping I set up the stage to get this going pretty easily. So we're going to just dive right in. So I'm going to go ahead and exit out of my PowerPoint here. So this is our SharePoint site. Pulling the curtain back a little bit, this is what we're excited about. So SharePoint 2010, this is your base SharePoint site. If you start a SharePoint site, this is what you're going to get. Now, inside SharePoint, essentially, the quick navigation, you have your lists and libraries that we have. Now, we're going to be really concentrating on this in just a second, but I want to show you this. This is what we've been talking about. This is the glory. Now, this is SharePoint 2010. This is one version behind the newest version, but still houses about 80% of people that are using SharePoint are using SharePoint 2010. Don't worry, I'm not going to show you out the people that are early migrators or late adopters that are still in 2007. Many of the functions and forms that I'm going to be showing you are available not only in SharePoint 2007, SharePoint 2010, and SharePoint 2013. So do not worry that we're not sharing maybe the version you're on is not the same version, because it will all be very relevant when you start doing your migration. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and take this down here, and I'm going to show you that I have a file system. So imagine this is my file share, and I have some documents in here. I have some accounts payable stuff, HR, IT, marketing. This might be something very similar that you're used to seeing. So if I go into my AP folder, I have some more folders there. I have some miscellaneous documents, some purchase orders, some reports. Inside there I have my documents. And I have a myriad of documents that are in here. I have some PDFs, I have some templates, I have some TIFF images, and essentially I have a big file share. Now I can go into each one and start a big spreadsheet on this, but that's very time consuming. And you're doing a manual migration, you might have limited time to do this. So what I do turn to, and something that we have available for you, and if you have on your computer, It's not real hard to learn. I'm going to turn to what's called PowerShell. PowerShell is essentially a scripting language that helps me do a lot of some of the manual migration, some of the manual touches that will necessarily will save me a lot of time in the long run. So what I'm going to actually do now, if this is a file share, if it's like a a G drive or /SharePoint or something like that, this will all work the same. Right now, this is just sitting on my desktop, so this might be something similar that you're already having. But PowerShell, once again, is located on your computer, and it looks like this. It's not very exciting, I know. But what it can do is will save you a lot of time. And I'm hoping that some of you guys will notice what I'm doing, and if you don't know, I will walk you through what I'm doing. So the first thing we're going to do is the discovery phase, finding out what content we have. So what I did previous of this webinar is I went ahead and wrote out my scripts. And the reason why I did this was just to make sure that we have some time to do everything. So the first thing I'm going to do is get all the content out of SharePoint or out of my file share. Now to do that, I wrote a command, right? So this is basically saying to PowerShell, get anything underneath this URL or this file system, and recursively go through. So I'm going to get every folder underneath. I'm going to tell it to export CSV, which is comma separated values, and I'm going to tell it where to export to. Now, once again, it's not too difficult, and if you have questions or if you want to learn more about PowerShell, please let me know, and we can definitely help out with that a little bit. But essentially, it's getting the children items recursively, so in folders. I want this folder, I want to export, and when I hit enter, essentially it acts like nothing happened. But if you've seen in my background here, I actually have a new CSV that's sitting here in the Excel format. Well, I know Excel. Hey, I can use Excel. So when I open up Excel, you can see that it's then pulled all the information back from my file system about all the files that I want. So I have the created time, last access time, last write time, so all the information that I really need. I have the extensions of the files that I'm looking at. I have the full name. I have what parent it is, what it comes from, the naming. So basically, once again, that inventory, this planning stage. So as I'm looking through my system, there's some things I don't necessarily need. Like I might not need the drive it's coming from. I might not need that it's a PowerShell system. But what I will need is where it's coming from, so what folder, what the name of it is, the full name. This is important for later in life because you're going to want, and you're going to have your users, if you're migrating stuff from file shares to SharePoint, they're going to be like, hey, where did this document go? It was right here. Essentially, you basically keep the spreadsheet around, even after the migration, to say, if it was here, we're going to move it here. That way you have a quick reference guide of wherever to look at. Another great part about this, and something that I want to show you, because we know how to use Excel, I'm going to go ahead and make this Excel a table. So I'm going to go ahead and grab all this and say I want to format this Excel sheet as a table. So now I have a sortable, fun piece here. Now the first thing I want to look at when I'm doing migration and taking some information is I want to find those exceptions. Remember how I said earlier, there's certain files that aren't allowed into your environment because they're just revoked, or they're too big, or there's too big of a name. So the thing I'm going to look at first is the extension, which will give me a good idea of what's in my environment. So I'm going to use a little drop down here and say, oh, cool, I can see all the different things that I want. But I see one of the files that I can't have in there. I have an exe in there. I can't put that in there. I also have, a PowerShell command. I don't want to put that in there. And then I also have a RAR file. So these files cannot get into SharePoint. I'm going to go ahead and filter down. I only have 3 of them, so that's not too bad. So I can see where they're located at, maybe take them out, delete them, do what I need to do with them. However, once again, if you have a big file share, manually deleting these might not be something that you want to do, or you might not have the ability to quickly filter down to find these guys. So I'm going to go actually back to PowerShell to find my exclusions, so things that I want to cancel out. So all these files that may be .exe or .rar or .ps1 or something along those lines, and I'm going to run a PowerShell command to find all those for me. So I'm out of my sheet here, go back to PowerShell. And once again, I have my scripts pre-written, so I'm going to go ahead and grab my script here and put it in there. Once again, I'm going to get the information underneath the folder system here. I'm going to do recursively, so I'm going to get inside the folders individually, and I want to only look for EXEs, PS1s, and RAR files. And essentially this list can grow depending on what your file system might come back in that initial discovery. And then once again, I'm going to export it to CSV, which is comma separated value, which is an Excel sheet. And then I'm going to tell it where it goes. Once again, I'm going to go ahead and hit the OK button. Nothing happened, but I did get my exclusions file back here. And when I open it up, it automatically tells me that I have 3 files in here that should be deleted out of my file system. Well, I know, let me go ahead and see where these are, just so I can take a look at them. Well, looking by my file system, they're all in the IT structure. Well, those IT people, they're always doing something wrong. So let's go ahead and take a look at what's in there. I'm going to go to IT. They're not even keeping folders. It's all dumped in there. And I see there's a RAR file. There's that PowerShell command, and there's that exe that's causing me all my issues. Well, once again, I can come in here and delete these out of here manually, or move them to an archive, or move them to a do not migrate folder. But if you have a lot of these, like these are only 20 documents. If you have thousands of documents, this may be a very time-consuming process to manually delete all these. So, anybody want to take a guess what I'm going to be doing next? If you're saying PowerShell, you are 100% correct. So I'm going to actually go back to my PowerShell commands here. Once again, this is the manual process. A lot of this can be done with, once again, this tools or an automated process. But once again, I want to show you the manual way because everything I'm showing you right now is free, doesn't cost you a thing, and you already own most of these tools. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and paste the next script in here. And I'm going to say get children item, once again, saying get all the stuff in the folders, include those EXEs, PS1s, and RAR files, and I'm going to say remove items. So the first thing I want to do, though, is I don't want to necessarily remove these. I just want to see what happens if I were to remove these. So I'm going to actually put on this little command called what if. Now what this does is it basically runs the command before it actually runs it. So I'm going to go ahead and enter, and it says what if performing this operation will remove these 3 files. Well, that's kind of what I want to do. So if I go ahead and run that same command without the what if, and I want to show you to make sure that there's no funny business going on. And behind my screen, you see the RAR file, you see the PS1, you see the EXE there, right? I'm going to go ahead and enter. And now you hopefully seen behind the scenes that my files have now gone. So now I have a pretty good spot that I want to, I got all the files out there that can't be migrated in, which provides me a little bit of ease. And once again, that planning side of the world will help you long term when you run into a folder full of EXEs that you can't migrate. Now, and also just to keep you guys in mind, we will be providing these PowerPoint slides in this video to everybody that's on all this as well. So if you want to get these commands that I'm running right now, and you can't see my screen and you can't type it fast enough, or you can't screenshot fast enough, please feel free to reach out. I'll give you these commands for you. That way you can use these as well. Now I got all the stuff that I don't want in there out of there. I'm almost ready to migrate, but let me go ahead and take a real quick inventory of how many files are actually migrating over. I have 20 mega files, not too bad. I have 47 files though. That might seem big to me because especially in a demonstration, we only have 40 minutes to show you this. So we might want to look at some files that haven't been touched for a while. So some of those archival processes that I was telling you about, define those information that might be, for example, old. Might not have been touched. Once again, anybody want to guess what I'm going to be doing? Once again, if you're saying PowerShell, you are 100% correct. Go back to my PowerShell commands, paste my PowerShell script in here. Once again, I'm going to say get my folder, get all the information in the folder, and look at the last write time. Saying that I want to see anything that hasn't been touched for a year, which is 365. That's that 365 portion of it. Now, this will show me all the files that maybe haven't been touched for a year. And at that point, then I can just say, do I really want to migrate that information into SharePoint? Do I want to get rid of it? And if you're a business unit and you're saying, hey, IT doesn't want to delete anything, I promise if you restrict their coffee intake, they will do whatever you want them to do. Coffee is the lifeblood. No, I'm just kidding. Hit the OK button. It'll show me all the information that's in there that's more than 365 days old. So I have a lot of files in there that's pretty old. I can go ahead and remove these, but for the time being, I want to keep all these documents in there just to show you what it looks like for a full system migration. But this is a command that you can quickly see. Performing operation will remove the file, this guy right here, because it's old. Now, I showed you how to get rid of old files. I showed you how to get rid of, file restrictions. The last thing left in our checklist of things to do are going to be looking for special characters. So that whole list of special characters that SharePoint will just not let in there. Before you're going hot and heavy in your migration efforts, I want to make sure we get those out of there before we run into a big issue. So if I look in my file system here and just to quickly scan through, I don't see anything in there. I don't see anything in there. So it doesn't look too bad. So there might not be anything in here that I have to worry about. But if you have a lot of file systems, this might not be relevant to be clicking through each one of these. So essentially, we can once again use a PowerShell command to get all the items that have special characters in there. So go back to my PowerShell commands here and paste my script in here. And I'm looking for ampersands. And there we go. It doesn't look like I have any ampersands in there. So what I'm going to do is put an ampersand in here so we have something to look at. So I'm going to go and say, rename my folder here, put an ampersand in there, and run my PowerShell script. And this will tell me, essentially, if I perform this operation, so I'm going to delete this file or rename it, this document will change from doc ampersand.png to just doc underscore. And we can choose what we replace those file names with. So once again, if I take that back and I take off my what if statement so I can actually run this command and hit enter, if I go back to my thing, you'll see that doc ampersand is now doc underscore. Once again, a quick way to get those ugly file names out of SharePoint or out of your file systems to get in there, to be able to migrate to SharePoint very easily. And this can be written for all the special characters that SharePoint does not like. So now I have all my documents in a good manner. Now, the one thing that we are missing, though, is now I have these folders. And what I do want to tell you guys is get rid of the folders. Trust me, it's intuitive. It's, something that you probably don't think of. Like, hey, I need my folders to tell what I need. Like, I know these are employee files because when I go into the employee folder, that's what they are. What we're going to leverage is using these folder names as metadata. And we're actually going to do that right now. So as you can see, most of the places that you have in most file systems have a structure to them. And when you're looking at your CSV, so in your discovery phase, you'll hopefully notice that where I have an AP folder, I have an HR folder, I have an IT folder, and a marketing folder. Well, this is telling me that I need to have 4 distinct places to store different files. And if I look at the permissions of each one of these guys, I can see maybe there's certain people that have access to the marketing that might not have access to IT. When we start mapping these individual pieces, we need to make sure that we're mapping folders and mapping these things to SharePoint content to make sure that the cutover, that migration is smooth as possible. So when I go into my AP process, I see I have some subfolders, which are miscellaneous, purchase orders, and reports. Well, if you guys remember a little earlier when I was talking about document types, so this content types, these can easily fit in this content types. Like, reports are basically some data that we can store about it. Purchase orders are a different type of data we can store about it. And miscellaneous, we have some more information we can store about it. So a lot of times when you're doing the discovery inside of SharePoint, to go to SharePoint, you'll start to notice a lot of what you already have is that map. It's just you have to connect those dots between what you have currently in your file systems to your SharePoint. So in planning, I would, as a SharePoint guy, say it would make sense to make your AP, your HR, and your IT and your marketing separate libraries. And inside these, I would make these individual folders content types. It doesn't make sense now, but I promise it will in just a second, and we'll talk about what each one of these are. So now that I have my file system in a migratable manner, I got all the special characters out of there, I got all the restrictions out of there, I think I'm going to be okay for migrating. So I'm going to go ahead and actually start to create the SharePoint resources to migrate into. So I'm going to go back to SharePoint. And now I have, once again, a plain Jane SharePoint site, nothing special here. So what I'm going to do is create a library for each one of those migrational folders. So to create libraries in SharePoint, you do have to have admin rights. Now, you may have admin rights on your current SharePoint environment, you may not. An easy way to tell is if you go into your Site Actions menu on the top left-hand corner and you use the pull-down, if you have admin rights, you'll see that you can create a new document library and create a new site and create some other options here. If you do have these rights, then you're in good shape. Now, if you don't have them, and you might just be a contributor or somebody that's just looking at the SharePoint environment from a downloading perspective, you might not have these rights. But what you can do is go back and request some rights, additional rights for this reason only. Say, hey, I need these rights to make some libraries to do a SharePoint file migration. So what I'm going to do is actually go ahead and click New Document Library. So So document libraries, once again, libraries are that place where we store documents so we can do document management on it. Now, I promise this isn't too hard. The first thing it's going to ask me for is the name. So I'm going to say AP Documents. It's always good practice to give it a description for 508 reasons, but also just to give the user, the end user, a good idea of what this is going to be stored for. Now the next thing we have is the ability to make this on the quick launch bar. What your quick launch bar is your left menu, this guy over here. Now for any reason you make a mistake on one of these guys, you can always go back and change it later in life. But setting up right the first time will definitely save you some time in the long run. So I do want it to display over here. That way I can get to it faster and make it a lot easier for me to get to. The next thing is, do you want to capture version history? So SharePoint, one of the great things about it is that ability to do versioning. So why would we want to keep it off when we're migrating in? So I'm going to go ahead and click the Yes button and hit Create. Now what that will do is put that link on that quick launch bar, that left menu, and it'll also direct me right into that library. So I have a library now. SharePoint, this is where, once again, SharePoint stores its information. Now, at this point, we can do a couple of different things. First thing we're going to need to do is put our content types on this. So to do content types and to do metadata in SharePoint, you can do it at the library settings level. So if I click Library Settings, this will provide me the time to do columns, which are metadata values. So I automatically captures the title, the created by, the modified by, some checked out information. But I can create new ones in here as well. The one thing that you don't see is the ability to do content types. Now this is one of the most commonly frustrated things that people have. Like, hey, Jason said create new content types, but I don't see where to create them at. To do content types at a library level, you have to go into your advanced settings. Under General Settings, Advanced Settings, when you click on it, you have the ability to turn on content types, which is just happens to be the first choice on the menu here. So in here, I can click Allow Management of Content Types to Yes. Now what this will do is the ability to add new content types. So I'm going to click Yes, scroll down, and hit OK. So now, when I go back to this menu, I can see that I have a big content type thing in the middle here. Now, this content type is going to be what I use for these different documents. Now, very important to know is, first, get rid of your default content type. Your document default content type is probably the worst one that you have the ability to use because it's a catch-all. It's that dumping ground that people will complain about all the time. So what we're going to do is actually create a new content type. So to create a new content type, to add it, I'm going to go up to Site Actions. I'm going to go to Site Settings. And when I open up this menu here, I have the ability to do Site Content Types. When I go in here, I'm going to go ahead and hit the Create button to create a new content type. Now going back to my file system, I can see that in my AP folder, I have miscellaneous purchase orders and reports, and I'm going to go ahead and use those as my content types. So the first one, I'm going to go ahead and do purchase orders. I'm going to select my parent, which is essentially what it inherits from, and add to the group called AP, and hit OK. Now I have the ability to add metadata about it. So maybe if there's specific metadata that I want to collect about it, for maybe where it's located at, what year is it from. So I'm actually going to go ahead and add a new metadata value to it, call it fiscal year. And I'm just going to keep it single line of text, keep it easy. There we go. So I have a content type called AP, or purchase orders. I have two metadata values I want to collect about it, title and fiscal year. And now I need to add this content type to my library. So if I go back to my AP Documents library, go to Library, go to Library Settings, hit Add from Existing Site Content Types, and then if I filter down to my Purchase Orders content type and add it, and hit OK, it is now in there. But my document, that pesky little dump ball, is still in there. I'm going to go ahead and delete that out of there. Now to delete this, you cannot just delete it only because it's the default content type. So to get rid of that, I have to change the new button order and default content type. I have to make sure a document is no longer the default content type. and go ahead and hit OK. And now I can delete it. So then I can click the document, content type, and hit delete this content type. Get rid of that catch-all. So now I have a content type in SharePoint. I have to add 2 other ones. So I'm going to do the same process 2 more times. But before I do that, and this is important to know, when you're not using a third-party tool and you're not using custom code and you're doing the method that we're doing, you have to do them based upon the content type. Meaning, when I start to migrate them in here, it has to be the only content type available for me. It has to be the default because it's going to accept those unless you want to go back and then change it later. So I'm going to go ahead and show you how to migrate these in here manually. So if I go to my library here, and I go to the library tab on top, I have this ability to open with Explorer. Now when I click this Open with Explorer button, what it'll do is it'll open up SharePoint file system to me. That way I can quickly just copy and paste documents from my file share to SharePoint. It takes a second. Now this will be able to produce that content type for me, and I'll show you actually how to do those folders as well using SharePoint views. So as this is opening up, you can see that now my documents are in here. I can see that it's AP documents. Now I can just quickly go to my folder system, grab all the purchase orders that I want, copy them, and paste them over here. Now once again, as you notice, I'm not moving the folders. I'm strictly just moving the document, and I'll show you why. So that's uploading, and I'm going to go ahead and do my other content types as I'm going to do this. So I'm going to go back to my site content types and add my miscellaneous content type. Go back to my document library, and as you can see, I'm starting to get my documents in here. Also very important to know, if you're doing a manual migration, you're copying and pasting it. One of the downsides of doing a manual process is you will lose your modified by, and your created by person. Unless you're doing custom code or you're updating it again via custom code or custom tool or a third-party tool, typically those are then lost. Now, as this is going, I want to add in a couple of things to this view, so how I see these documents. And we are running about close to time, so I'm going to do this real quickly just to show you what I'm talking about and finish up this migration. We'll open the floor for questioning. So you can see the purchase orders are coming in, and now I also have FY. So I'm going to go ahead and change the content type, the default content type again. So I'm going to add my miscellaneous guy here. Change the default to be AP. Now that's the default. I'm going to go back to my copy and pasting here. It's not going to take an hour, I promise. Grab my miscellaneous documents and paste these guys in here. So as this is copying over, I want to show you how to add metadata to them. So now I migrated the documents in here. They're in here. But 2 things I want to show you is add metadata to it. We're going to use datasheet view. And then essentially opens up into a spreadsheet that I can then enter in my dates really quickly. And I can do this based on spreadsheet, based on whatever I may have. So in all, that's going to be the quick way to quickly do a migration from your file system to SharePoint using PowerShell, governance, making sure you have a plan, making sure you're using SharePoint libraries and SharePoint columns, to making sure that these information is tagged correctly and making sure that it is then searchable and then filterable based upon those documents. Now we have about 5 minutes left on this webinar, so I want to open it up for questions. Please use your question pane on the side, and if you have any follow-up questions, once again, if you have questions on maybe something I went over or something that you want to see, like you want those PowerShell commands or you want to see more about the migration, feel free to please reach out. Here's our contact information, our phone number, and our website. Please reach out. We can do a one-on-one session with you and provide you a little bit more personalized information for yourself. Once again, I want to thank everybody for attending our webinar. Once again, we're going to open up everything for questionings. Please use the question pane, or feel free to reach out separately to our number there. And I'm going to leave it to Ed to wrap us up here.